The VTC meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is the situation in the Middle East. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representatives of the Islamic Republic of Iran, the Syrian Arab Republic, and Turkey to participate in the meeting today. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the following briefers to participate in this meeting. Mr. Geir Pederson, Special Envoy of the Secretary General for Syria, and Mr. Bernard Duhan, current member and former chair rapporteur of OHCHR's UN Working Group on Enforced and Involuntary Disappearances. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. I now give the floor to Mr. Geir Pederson.
Thank you, Madam President. I hope you can all hear me clearly. The Syrian conflict has now raged for 10 years, roughly the length of World War I and World War II combined. 10 years ago, peaceful popular demonstrations were violently suppressed. Syria was sent into a spiral of armed conflict. In time, many countries and fighters from across the whole world came to Syria to fight in one form or another. It must sometimes feel to ordinary Syrians that they are all trapped in an endless and global conflict. The Syrian tragedy will go down as one of the darkest chapters in recent history. The Syrian people are among the greatest victims of this century. On this grim anniversary, I want to commemorate Syrian victims and remember Syrian suffering and resilience in the face of unimaginable violence and indignities that all Syrians, men and women, from all areas and all backgrounds have faced over 10 long years. They have been injured, maimed, and killed in every way imaginable, their corpses even desecrated. They have been snatched from the streets, thrown into prison, or abducted, disappeared, mistreated, tortured, paraded in cages, and ransomed or exchanged in prisoner swap deals. They have witnessed their homes, markets, hospitals, schools, and utilities being destroyed by airstrikes, barrel bombs, rocket and mortar fire, and IEDs. They have endured the unspeakable horrors of chemical weapons. They have been denied humanitarian assistance, sometimes under sieges in which perpetrators deliberately starved the population. They have faced human rights violation on an enormous and systematic scale and endured countless violations of international humanitarian law. They have seen the largest Security Council listed terrorist organizations in the recent memory take over a third of their country, a group so violent and extreme that it enslaved women and girls and sold them in markets. They have seen foreign fighters flooding into their country. They have seen front lines and fault lines emerge across the country as 5 foreign armies jostle in the theater. They have been displaced into city-sized camps or to sleep in the open in olive groves and abandoned houses, only to be displaced again and again in baking heat and freezing snow. They have fled Syria, often only to face further poverty and discrimination, or worse, perishing at sea in search of refuge. They have been dispossessed of their lands and homes. They have watched their middle-income country dragged back into de-development and destitution on such a scale that it will take generations to rebuild. They have experienced corruption, mismanagement, sanctions, and economic meltdown. 9 in 10 Syrians now live in poverty. Their currency has collapsed, with savings and livelihoods evaporating overnight, and their money worth a minuscule fraction of what it was before the war. They have waited for hours queuing for bread and fuel, searched the pharmacies for medicines that were not on the shelves, or from their hospitals lacking essential medical equipment. They have faced the COVID-19 pandemic with a depleted and devastated health system. Syrian women have faced conflict-related sexual violence from all parties and the rise in early and forced marriages. Most Syrian children have never lived a day without war. Many have gone without food, medicine, or education, or been detained, recruited for battle, injured, or killed. And every Syrian parent must feel anguish that the legacy of this conflict will last for the lifetime of every treasured newborn child. Madam President, Syrians meanwhile observed that those responsible for action that may amount to crimes against humanity or war crimes enjoy near total impunity. Ordinary Syrians have also seen no compromise between incompatible political visions and no real progress in talks between the government and opposition to reconcile those visions. And all Syrians have seen that the international community has been divided, trapped in geopolitical competition, caught in their own competing narratives, and often focused on supporting one side in the conflict. The world has not succeeded in helping deliver the Syrians as one people from what the Secretary General has called a living nightmare. I express the profound regret of the United Nations that we have yet not been able to mediate an end to this tragic conflict. Madam President, amidst this tragedy, one silver lining is that a relative calm now exists, at least in the terms of front lines not shifting for a year now. But the calmest year of the Syrian conflict has still been tremendously violent by any other measure. There is still frequent mutual shelling and rocket fire along contact lines and violent unrest. Airstrikes from Syrian and foreign parties have continued, and listed terrorist groups remain active and present in Syria. Thus, the lightning flashes of war still crack daily in Syria, and dark clouds gather. The greatest danger of all is that the fragile calm unravels, leading to a new storm of all of conflict and all that it would mean for Syrians, the region, and beyond. This is why I will always stress, first and foremost, the importance of consolidating this fragile calm into a true nationwide ceasefire according to Resolution 2254, together with a common approach to addressing the continuing challenge of listed terrorist groups in Syria. Madam President, the other danger facing Syria is that even if calm does not collapse, prolonged stasis sets in, and the Syrian people endure a new decade of desperation, despondency, and despair. That is a grave danger, especially if Syria does not receive high-level and creative international diplomatic attention. Yes, the Syrian parties must negotiate a settlement in the Syrian-led process convened by the UN to implement Security Council Resolution 2254. And they need to show the political will to do so. But I'm absolutely convinced that they will not progress far if a Syrian-led process is not supported by a constructive international diplomacy in Syria. After all, This is among the most deeply internationalized conflicts of the generation, with many of the issues that matter most to the Syrians not even in Syrian hands. I know that progress will not be easy. There is very little trust and confidence among the Syrians and between regional and international actors. The divisions are deep and they are everywhere we look. But we need to find a way around the "you first" syndrome that characterizes much diplomacy on Syria. Right now, there are demands on all sides, but little movement on any side. Madam President, what should be plain to each side is that progress on particular objectives is unlikely without matching progress on objectives of concern to the other side. Thus, what is needed is to identify with realism and precision and to implement in parallel mutual and reciprocal steps for step by step from Syrian and international players. For this to succeed, the Syrian government and opposition and key international players will need to be ready to identify not only what they realistically hope to achieve, but what they can put on the table in the context of advancing Resolution 2254. We will need to break issues into their component parts and move in lockstep to make steady progress. There are, of course, many ways this could be done, but what is needed are good steps for good steps. We all have to work in this direction for the sake of the Syrian people. Madam President, I discussed my thinking on all aspects of the political process recently in the first meeting in Damascus with Faisal Mekdad in his capacity as the new foreign minister of the Syrian Arab Republic, and with the president of the Syrian Negotiations Commission, Anas Al-Abda, in Istanbul, and in a range of international travels and virtual contacts. I will continue to explore possibilities. Madam President, I believe we need to continue quiet diplomacy in this regard. I'm working on this. In time, we may need to try to put in place a new means of international discussion, a new international format for the necessary diplomacy and cooperation. Madam President, allow me to stress the importance of unblocking progress on the issue of detainees, abductees, and missing persons. Neither my efforts nor those of the working group on this issue have produced the kind of progress needed. Yet I'm absolutely convinced that if we could make inroads here, it would be an important humanitarian gesture, a vital confidence builder, a signal to all Syrians, and a circuit breaker in the context of international diplomacy. I take this opportunity also to strongly underline the need for full, sustained, and unimpeded humanitarian access to all parts of Syria. Intensified cross-line and cross-border deliveries are essential to reach everyone in need, everywhere. I reiterate the appeal of the Secretary General to the Security Council to achieve consensus on this crucial matter. Let me also reiterate the Secretary General's appeal regarding the importance of avoiding and mitigating any effects of sanction measures on the capacity of Syria to access food, essential health supplies, and COVID-19 medical support, and on the plight of civilians across Syria. Madam President, let me finally turn to the work of the Syrian-led and owned Constitutional Committee. As I have often said, it cannot on its own, of course, solve the conflict, but it could be a building block of intra-Syrian cooperation in implementing Resolutions 2254's call for drafting a new constitution. It could also be a door opener to a broader process that could create safe, calm, and neutral conditions for constitutional reform to take hold in Syria and for the conduct of free and fair elections, administered under UN supervision, with all Syrians, including members of the diaspora, to participate. And of course, the safe, dignified, and voluntary return of Syrian refugees, all in the context of progress in a step-for-step manner, as I have indicated. A sixth session of the small drafting body of the Constitutional Committee needs to be carefully prepared, and assurances should be in place to ensure that it implements the terms of reference and core rules of procedure, restores and builds some trust and confidence, and makes progress on the committee's mandate. A sixth session needs to be different from what has gone before, with some clear goals, credible working methods, enhanced co-chair cooperation, and a future work plan. I will continue to engage the Syrian parties, the Syrian co-chairs, and the middle third as we seek to advance the Constitutional Committee. The co-chair nominated by the Syrian government, Ahmed al-Kusbari, shared a proposal with me in Damascus on 23rd February. I convey that to co-chair nominated by the Syrian Negotiations Commission, Hadi al-Bara, who reverted with an amended proposal on 11th March. I have conveyed that to the co-chair nominated by the Syrian government. I spoke to both co-chairs in recent days. I appreciate that both co-chairs have committed procedural proposals to writing and that they are both engaging. And I continue to facilitate their exchanges in the hope of concluding an agreement. The United Nations will be ready to convene a sixth session as soon as agreement is in place. Madam President, I was able to brief you last week on International Women's Day on the ways in which we are seeking as facilitators to ensure that the determination of Syrian women to play their full part in the political process is made real. And I will continue to engage the Women's Advisory Board for their insights and advice on all aspects of the process. Let me also stress that I will continue to engage the participants in the civil society support room, women and men. I pay tribute today to all those Syrians who continue to work day and night for peace. They have never given up hope, and neither will the United Nations. I hope that the members of this council will not give up either. At a time when there are so many pressing challenges, do not lose sight of the fundamental importance of a peaceful resolution of the Syrian conflict. A political solution is the only way out, and I am convinced that it is possible. In some ways, it is more possible now than before. But to turn those possibilities into realities, creative and high-level engagement from key international players with a stake in this conflict will be needed. Now is surely the time to advance a genuine political process that restores the sovereignty, unity, independence, and territorial integrity of Syria and enables the Syrian people to independently chart their own future. With that goal in mind, let us ensure that Syria receives top-level and sustained attention and that we work together to implement Security Council Resolution 2254. Thank you so much, Madam President.
I thank Mr. Pederson for his briefing, and I now give the floor to Mr. Bernard Dehane.
Madam President, Your Excellencies, it gives me great honor and privilege to address you on behalf of the Working Group on Enforced or Involuntary Disappearances as a member and former chair. Today, we reflect on the 10th anniversary of the conflict in Syria, which has inflicted huge suffering on Syrian women and men, girls and boys across the country. As clearly stated in the 1992 Declaration on the Protection of All Persons from Enforced Disappearances, any act of enforced disappearance is an offense to human dignity. It is condemned as a denial of the purposes of the Charter of the United Nations and as a grave and flagrant violation of human rights and fundamental freedoms. The Working Group as the oldest special procedure mechanism of the Human Rights Council, with a distinct humanitarian and human rights mandate, was created in 1980 to act as a channel of communication between relatives of disappeared persons and the relevant authorities, with a view to clarifying their fate or whereabouts. To this end, our working group receives and examines reports of enforced disappearances submitted by relatives or human rights organizations acting on their behalf, and transmits them to the governments concerned. The working group requests the governments to conduct independent and effective investigations into enforced disappearances, carry out the search for the disappeared or their remains, and protect the right to truth, justice, reparation, and memory of the victims and their relatives. Since the start of the conflict, the working group has transmitted 509 individual cases to the government of Syria concerning the alleged enforced disappearance of 478 men and 31 women, including children, which are reported to have occurred throughout the country. At present, 490 cases remain outstanding, which connotes that our working group has received very little information from the government or the respective sources, which could be determined to be sufficient to clarify the fate and whereabouts of the individual concerned. As in most countries in the world, but particularly in the Syrian context, the number of cases registered with the working group represents only the tip of the iceberg of the phenomenon, which, according to a number of consistent and reliable reports, including the most recent report on arbitrary imprisonment and detention issued by the Independent International Commission of Inquiry on the Syrian Arab Republic, remains widespread and systematic. Since 2011, we requested the government an invitation to visit the country in the context of our mandate. Unfortunately, no response has yet been received, in spite of several reminders. In this respect, we recall Human Rights Council resolutions S18/1 and 19/22, calling on the Syrian authorities to cooperate with the special procedures of the Human Rights Council, including by allowing country visits, and with the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, including throughout the establishment of field presence. In 2014, increasingly concerned about the extent and scale of enforced disappearances in Syria, the working group decided to call for action by the highest United Nations bodies to tackle the issue. In particular, our group requested the President of the Security Council to bring the matter to the attention of the Council for any appropriate action, including considering referring it to the International Criminal Court. We have reiterated this call every year since in our annual report to the Human Rights Council. The vast majority of cases reported to the working group relate to enforced disappearances perpetrated by Syrian government forces or armed groups that operate with its support or acquiescence. In addition, our group has also started examining cases of acts tantamount to enforced disappearances perpetrated by non-state armed groups that exercise effective control and or government-like functions over parts of the Syrian territory. In doing so, the working group acts pursuant to its humanitarian mandate to address a growing protection gap affecting disappeared individuals and their relatives who have been denied information on the fate and whereabouts of their loved ones. Common to all these cases is the immense suffering and the lack of an effective remedy to address the plight of the relatives. Madam President, the working group observes that enforced disappearances are perpetrated unabatedly with impunity throughout Syria in clear violation of international law. The cases documented by our group illustrate an alarming pattern of arbitrary arrests of men, in particular, at their home or at checkpoints. Often several individuals are arrested at the same time in single raids. The impression left on the relatives is that the intention behind the carrying out of massive public arrests is to suppress dissent and instill fear in the local community. The deprivation of liberty is normally followed by a refusal on the part of the Syrian authorities or non-state actors to disclose information about the fate or whereabouts of the concerned person or even to acknowledge their existence. Reports suggest that many individuals were subjected to torture and cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment, which also led to deaths in custody. The relatives describe desperate attempts to obtain further information about their loved ones, often over a prolonged period. In the absence of official mechanisms for obtaining further information, it is left to the relatives' own initiative to undertake the necessary inquiries, often in the face of intimidation and targeted reprisals. The working group stresses the need to fully recognize that in the case of enforced disappearances, victims are not only those who disappear, but also those who suffer harm as a result of it. Those left behind, in fact, in addition to the anguish and sorrow caused by the absence of their loved ones, also suffer grave consequences affecting their economic, social, and cultural rights. Even when death is confirmed by the authorities, the remains of the victims are rarely returned to the relatives for burial, further exacerbating their anguish and suffering. In the apparent absence of an effective inquiry, a marked increase in the issuance of formal death notification to relatives of the disappeared has further epitomized the rampant culture of impunity. We are also alarmed, as indicated in our latest annual report to the Human Rights Council, by numerous instances of several members of the same family being subjected to enforced disappearances, including children as young as 7 years old. Madam President, 40 years ago, the working group was established owing to the relentless activism of the relatives. Within the remits of its mandate, the working group has worked with the relatives and for the relatives to establish the fate and whereabouts of their family members, raise awareness about enforced disappearances as a continuous crime, and bring about its end around the world. The working group recognizes a comprehensive and rights-based vision advanced by the Truth and Justice Charter, which was presented by 5 Syrian Family Associations on 10 February 2021. The Charter calls for collective action to hold perpetrators accountable and protect the rights of victims and their relatives to remedies. In this context, the working group underscores that all duty bearers must ensure full transparency and accountability in relation to persons in their custody, account for their fate and whereabouts to relatives, and ensure that due process and fair trial rights are respected and protected. All places of detention, official and unofficial, should be disclosed with complete lists of names and formal registrations of all those held in these facilities, and ensure that persons are only held in recognized facilities. Victims, including families, should be granted the right to an effective remedy, which should include cessation of violation, compensation, rehabilitation, satisfaction, and guarantees of non-repetition. The working group joins the recent call for the creation of an independent mechanism with an international mandate to clarify the fate and whereabouts of missing and disappeared persons, locate mass graves, exhume and identify human remains of these individuals, and return them to their relatives with due respect for cultural customs. The dramatic situation in Syria has lasted for too long. It is now time for the United Nations, including the Security Council, as well as for other international community mechanisms, to demonstrate that they are able to respond to the challenges and meet the rights and needs of the victims in Syria. Bringing closure to so many families after a decade of trauma and loss depends on our collective and coordinated action. The working group stands ready to contribute to this process. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank Mr. Dahim for his briefing. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the representative of the United States.
Excuse me, Madam President, I'm sorry to interrupt you. There is distortion on your microphone. If you could refresh, please. This will help our colleagues. Thank you.
I'm not sure how to do that. How am I now?
That's much better. Thank you, President. Please proceed.
Good. Thank you very much. I'm now taking the floor in my capacity as the U.S. representative. Let me start by thanking you, Special Envoy Pederson, for your thorough evaluation and recommendations. We encourage and support your continued efforts toward creative solutions that will bring the current crisis in Syria to an end. And thank you to Mr. Duhim for your insights and for all the work that you do to help the families of those who've been detained or disappeared. Today, exactly 10 years ago, the Syrian people peacefully took to the streets. They chanted slogans for freedom and held up pictures of detained friends and relatives. They called for an end to government corruption. They asked the government to respect their human rights. The people were filled with hope, solidarity, and song. And what response did they get? The Assad regime responded with violence. As the Secretary General recently noted, and I quote, "The violent suppression of peaceful popular demonstrations in Syria set the country on the path to a horrific war." And now for a full decade, the Syrian people have endured the unimaginable. A full decade of violent suppression, a full decade of terrorism, and a full decade of a brutal civil war. Imagine being a 10-year-old child in Syria who has never experienced life free of conflict. One of your parents may have been killed by chemical weapons attack or Russian airstrikes, or one of the 500,000 killed by Assad's brutal regime. Some of your relatives were tortured and disappeared. You're one of 13 million Syrians who were forced to flee your home. You're gaunt, likely malnourished. You see only sadness in your parents' eyes. You see tanks on the streets. Look out for snipers on rooftops. You're barely able to survive. You're 10 years old and you've known nothing but war. For that child and so many others, we must allow and empower humanitarians to do their jobs and save people's lives. The United States considers not only the Security Council's July authorization of cross-border assistance, but its strengthening and expansion, essential to ensuring delivery of food, medicine, COVID-19 vaccines, and other life-saving assistance into Syria. As the Secretary General said last week, more humanitarian access is needed. Intensified cross-line and cross-border deliveries are essential to reach everyone in need everywhere. We know very clearly that cross-line aid alone cannot reach all those in need. It would be inhumane and unconscionable for the Security Council to halt the UN's ability to deliver aid to all Syrians. And we call on Security Council members to support this important mechanism, a lifeline that is even more important given COVID-19. To put a permanent end to this suffering, the United States remains committed to achieving a political solution to the Syrian conflict, per the parameters outlined in UN Security Council Resolution 2254. We strongly support Special Envoy Pederson's efforts aimed at enhancing and advancing a political settlement. There's only one reason we have not been able to enact this solution and resolve this crisis: the Assad regime's refusal to engage in good faith. The regime has not taken a single step that would lay the groundwork for peace. So we call on Russia to press the Assad regime to quit stalling. It's time for the regime to address the conflict's root cause, the basic demand of all Syrians to live in dignity, free from torture, abuse, and arbitrary detention. And I would ask the international community to not be fooled by upcoming Syrian presidential elections. These elections will neither be free nor fair. They will not legitimize the Assad regime. They do not meet the criteria laid out in Resolution 2254, including that they be supervised by the UN or conducted pursuant to a new constitution. Instead of delaying and distracting, the Assad regime should release those who have been arbitrarily detained, particularly women, children, and the elderly. On March 2nd, I attended a high-level panel in the General Assembly, where I heard the stories of those who have been detained. One of the briefers, Wafa Mustafa, relayed a horror of being locked up in a regime-run detention center when she was just 21 years old. She's still searching for her father, one of over 100,000 who have been arbitrarily detained and forcibly disappeared by the Assad regime. So today, I asked the Special Envoy to provide an update on his efforts to locate and release detainees. The United States asked the Special Envoy to continue to strengthen Geneva-based efforts to work toward release of detainees, including assistance with locating and returning missing Americans like Austin Tice and Majad Kamalmaz. We hope to see an increase in UN personnel engaging directly and more regularly with families of the detained, former detainees themselves, and civil society representatives. Special Envoy Pederson, I ask you to provide an update on your efforts to locate and release detainees and your views on how the Council can assist. It is time to advance a real political solution. The Syrian people deserve progress and dignity. They deserve a safe, stable, and hopeful future. And as I've said before, the 11th anniversary cannot look like the 10th. Thank you very much. I assume my function as President of the Council, and I would draw attention of speakers to paragraph 22 of Note 507, which encourages all participants in Council meetings to deliver their statements in 5 minutes or less, in line with the Security Council's commitment to making more effective use of open meetings. I now give the floor to the representative of Russia Federation.
Thank you, Madam President. We are grateful to Geir Pederson for his briefing. We carefully listened to Mr. Bernard Duhem. On the anniversary of the Syrian crisis, two questions arise. What enabled this horrific conflict to last so long? And what are we able to do to ensure it ends swiftly? The outbreak in March 2011 of unrest in Syria was tapped into by external forces to stir up the situation in the country. Their aim was to overthrow the legitimate Syrian authorities and reshape the country in their own mold. The country swiftly plunged into chaos, and in most of the country, illegal armed formations took hold. These included international groups which terrorized the local population, creating an atmosphere of extremism and intolerance. And basically, they carried out terrible crimes against civilians. Despite this unprecedented terrorist onslaught, the Syrian state stood firm. With the decisive support of Russia, the legitimate Syrian authorities managed to rout ISIL and defeat other hotbeds of terrorism in their country. In the liberated areas, work has started to rebuild the social and economic infrastructure that was destroyed. As part of effective and measured actions of the Astana format, Russia, Turkey, and Iran have jointly achieved a sustainable cessation of hostilities in most of the country. There are still flare-ups of tension in the Idlib de-escalation area, where a group recognized by the UN Security Council as a terrorist organization, namely Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, has taken hold. Today, in the country, basically the ceasefire is holding. And if the supplying of fighters and separatists were to end, along with attempts to exonerate them, then the whole of Syria would now be free from extremists. From our side, we are convinced that the Syrian conflict cannot be resolved with military means. It can only be settled by fostering a lasting political process based on the Security Council Resolution 2254 with the assistance of the UN. In line with the decisions of the Congress of Syrian National Dialogue in Sochi, the Syrian Constitutional Committee got up and running. Its work is progressing with difficulty. However, it's important to wholeheartedly support and encourage this process. However, we believe that intra-Syrian talks are solely a domestic matter for Syrians themselves, which should not be subject to artificially imposed timetables or external pressure. We are prepared to continue to provide support to the SG's Special Envoy, Mr. Pederson, in establishing constructive relations between the Syrian parties. I would like to say that more than ever, Syrian authorities need the support of the international community. In his latest statement, the Secretary General stated that today 60% of Syria's population is facing the threat of hunger. People need collective international assistance. However, simply distributing food is not going to solve the problem. There's a need to help ordinary Syrians to rebuild their normal lives by carrying out infrastructure projects for early recovery. We're convinced that this approach will make it easier for Syrian refugees and IDPs to return home. Surveys have indeed shown that most of them still cherish the hope of returning to Syria. Despite all the obvious hardships of the Syrian people, the political opponents of Damascus decided to beat the country into submission. After the failure of the attempt to overthrow the undesirable government by force, they started to exert financial and economic pressure. Recently, Syria has been pummeled by sanctions, which have curbed normal life in the country. Ordinary Syrians de facto are subject to collective punishment. Moreover, the Western countries' humanitarian exemptions to the sanctions regime in reality don't work. This will lead to a further deterioration of the socio-economic situation in the country. And this situation, incidentally, is strongly criticized by UN humanitarian workers who work on the ground in Syria. The situation in Syria would significantly improve if it were to return to the Arab family, and in particular the League of Arab States. We welcome the willingness of Damascus and the Arab states to make progress in this area. And we would call for this burgeoning normalization of relations between Damascus and the Arab world to be left well alone. We view a key precondition in the peace settlement to be the cessation of foreign occupation and military activities which have not been approved by the legitimate government of the country. Another precondition is the respect for the sovereignty, independence and territorial integrity and unity of Syria as stipulated in Resolution 2254. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation, and I now give the floor to the representative of Mexico.
Thank you, Madam President. I would like to thank Special Envoy Pederson and Mr. Duhaime for their respective briefings. As has been mentioned, it has now been a decade of conflict in Syria, 10 years, whereby we have borne witness to a crisis of grave consequences for humanity, a decade where the international community and this council specifically has failed by not fulfilling the commitment to, quote, preserve future generations from the scourge of war, end quote, which is the basis of the United Nations Charter. The economic and human costs are thus unacceptable, and the task of this council and the international community continues to be the same: to put an end to the violence in Syria once and for all. After 10 years in which it is the civilians who have paid the highest price, it is clear that the political path is the only way to put an end to the suffering of millions of people. Despite the efforts of the United Nations, the efforts of the Constitutional Committee continue to be stalled, as are discussions in other topics such as the release of detainees. We would reiterate our call that the participants in the political process facilitated by the Special Envoy engage in good faith in a committed and constructive manner in order to achieve an agreement that would bring about peace and prosperity for the Syrian people. We are aware of the gravity of the impact of the war on women, boys, and girls. In this month, where we are also commemorating the International Day of Women, I should like to recall the story of a young Syrian woman, Yusra Mardini, who was part of the Olympic team of refugees in 2016. At the age of 17, Yusra was compelled to leave her country, embarked on a trip to Lebanon via Turkey in order to reach Europe. In the middle of the Mediterranean Sea, the raft where Yusra and her sister were traveling along with 20 other refugees fell apart. Yusra, along with her sister and two other people, jumped to sea and swam, dragging the raft behind them until they reached safety. Yusra is an example of the strength and determination of the Syrian people, of those who have sought refuge outside their country and who remain there. What is tragic here is that thousands of women and girls from Syria are suffering the consequences of the conflict without being able to escape, as did Yusra. They continue to be victims of different types of gender-based violence and violations of their human rights. Many others do not know the whereabouts of their sons, spouses, fathers, or brothers. More than 12,000 minors have died as a result of the war or have been wounded in this decade, whereas the majority of boys and girls continue to need humanitarian assistance. Madam President, the international community and the United Nations are indebted to all of those girls, young people, and young Syrian women who are still suffering from violence in their country. And every minute that passes, this council, the Security Council, is complicit through inaction or the inability to put an end to this embarrassing and shameful conflict. Those who are responsible for the atrocities inflicted on the Syrian people need to be held accountable. The recent ruling of guilt handed down by a German tribunal for crimes against humanity against a former Syrian official show the scope of the weight of law. We hope that new rulings will be handed down there where crimes have been committed that should not go unpunished. We would call upon all states to cooperate with the international impartial and independent mechanism And we would recall here that this mechanism was established by the General Assembly given the paralysis of the Council, specifically to combat impunity. Committing atrocities and international crimes need to be sent to the International Criminal Court. These crimes should be referred to that court. The recent findings of the investigation committee are alarming with regard to detentions and forced disappearances perpetrated in Syria since 2011. We demand that all those people who have been detained arbitrarily be released, as well as light being shared on as quickly as possible on the thousands of disappeared who have been claimed. As long as there's no military solution in the conflict in Syria, Mexico would reiterate its concern with the abuse by some states by invoking Article 51 of the United Nations Charter for the use of force without having the authorization to do so by this council. Moreover, with this practice, the risk is run of broadening de facto exceptions to the general prohibition on the use of force as set forth in Article 2, Paragraph 4 of the Charter. Mexico echoes the call of the Secretary General. It is necessary to support the efforts of the Special Envoy to bring about a national ceasefire and to establish mechanisms that would build confidence in order to create a safer environment and one that's safer on the ground. The purpose is none other than to address the main concerns of the Syrian population identified in Resolution 2254 and to make sure that they are finally attended to. I would conclude by reiterating the premise which brought about the birth of the Mexican-French initiative. The veto cannot be used when it is about avoiding putting an end to the commission of atrocities. After 10 years of war and human suffering, the time has come to say enough already. Enough with the violence and concentrate our efforts on diplomacy. We will also be held accountable for our acts and for our omissions. Thank you very much, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Mexico for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Norway.
Thank you, President, and thank you to the Special Envoy for your compelling briefing. Let me also thank Mr. Bernard Dehaene from the working group. As the Special Envoy so strongly pronounced, this month marks the 10th anniversary of the Syrian conflict. The fact that this conflict is still ongoing is indeed a sad reflection of the international community and of all of us failing the Syrian people. We should use this tragic anniversary not only to reflect on our mistakes, but to look for ways to changing the dynamics of the conflict and actually moving forward. But as the Special Envoy has highlighted, Syrians themselves must own the political process. We urge the government of Syria and the opposition to put the needs of the people first and move the constitutional process and the broader peace process forward. We commend the inclusion of civil society and would urge the Special Envoy to continue to draw on the expertise of civil society members of the Constitutional Committee. This conflict cannot be solved by Syrians alone. Several actors remain deeply involved in the conflict, and they all need to be part of the solution. President, we, the broader international community, also need to ask ourselves, how can we contribute to unlock this stalled peace process, to help parties move to a phase of progress and difficult compromise from all sides? Progress on the political track is the key to stability, development, and the return of the refugees to Syria. Norway gives its full support to the Special Envoy in his effort to engage with the parties and relevant actors in the political process. Turning to the latest development, we have taken note that there will most likely not be a sixth round of negotiation in the Constitutional Committee before Ramadan. Although the lack of progress is disappointing, we know the parties have worked on proposals, and we welcome the Special Envoy's recent talks with the parties and other relevant actors. In order not to lose momentum, input and feedback from all sides needs to be timely and unambiguous. The coming weeks should be used to prepare for the next round of talks to ensure the Syrian parties can move closer to a reformed constitution, one which addresses the need of the people and contributes to a political settlement. Norway continues to call the implementation of all aspects of Resolution 2254. This resolution was agreed by consensus in the Council, and there remains broad agreement that this is the framework we have for a political settlement. We have a responsibility to ensure it is implemented. Today, the constitutional track is the most active part, but we need to ensure progress also on other issues in tandem. I would especially highlight the importance of releasing those arbitrarily imprisoned and detained. This is a key issue for the Syrian people and for building confidence between the parties. We urge the parties to contribute in good faith to this process and to work with the Special Envoy and his team to find solutions. Finally, President, the lack of accountability for violation and abuses against civilians is untenable. Those responsible for atrocities must be held accountable, and the rights and needs of the victim must be ensured. Accountability remains central to achieving durable peace and a national reconciliation process. No amount of time, not even a decade, can erase this need. Thank you.
Representative of Norway for her statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of St. Vincent and the Grenadines.
Thank you, Madam President, and I thank Special Envoy Pederson and Mr. Duheim for their briefings. The Syrian conflict has created violent instability, claiming the lives of hundreds of thousands, displacing millions, and decimating the country's economy and infrastructure. And today, 10 years after the harrowing conflict began, the Syrian people continue to pay the highest price with their untold suffering. Special Envoy Pederson underscored earlier today that the Syrian conflict is undoubtedly the darkest chapter in recent human history. How much longer will we remain on this path, saying and doing the same thing and expecting a different result? It is past time to set aside self-interest. It is past time to set aside the need to be right. It is past time to climb down and think anew. It is time for self-reflection. It is time to challenge one's own perceptions, perspectives, approaches, and ask the really hard questions. How could we continue to say with any real credibility that we care about the people of Syria? Recently, I had the privilege to speak with persons on the ground. At the end of it, I cried. They cried. They concluded by simply saying, "We just want to live in dignity and in peace." Madam President, there remains no alternative to a political resolution to this protracted crisis. For this reason, the work of the Constitutional Committee must be re-energized, and the parties must endeavor to make tangible progress in the pursuit of peace and stability. In this regard, we recognize the work of the Special Envoy thus far, and we continue to urge the parties to recommit to working together in a spirit of mutual respect and compromise. Furthermore, we emphasize the importance of the meaningful participation of women and youth in all discussions to ensure a sustainable and equitable peace for all Syrians. The viability and eventual success of a wider political process requires parties to the conflict to undertake confidence-building measures. These acts of goodwill will undoubtedly cultivate trust and encourage much-needed national reconciliation. Accordingly, the issues of missing and arbitrarily detained persons necessitate urgent attention. Resolution 2254 acknowledges the close linkage between a ceasefire and the parallel political process. The perpetuation of hostilities denies an environment conducive to the fulfillment of the process and the restoration of stability. March 5th marked 1 year since the Idlib agreement, which has largely held, yet we remain concerned by the continued reports of sporadic violence. The security situation is fragile, and we therefore strongly urge parties to the conflict to exercise maximum restraint to preserve the ceasefire. We further appeal to the parties to respect their obligations under international law in the conduct of all military and counterterrorism activities. The link between justice and peace has long been recognized, and we reiterate that accountability for atrocities committed since the commencement of the war ought to remain a high priority. The cessation of hostilities is also indispensable to the creation of conditions for the safe, dignified, and voluntary return of refugees and IDPs. So too is the reconstruction of the country's critical infrastructure. Syria cannot go it alone. As such, we echo our appeal to the international community to contribute to the country's rebuilding. The suffering of Syrian people will continue in the absence of a Syrian-owned and Syrian-led, credible, balanced, and inclusive political process that meets their legitimate aspirations. In support of this, the international community bears a great responsibility to engage in a pragmatic way by prioritizing the people of Syria and setting aside geopolitical disputes, which have compounded the complexities of the conflict. This dictates the removal of all unauthorized foreign forces in respect of Syria's sovereignty and territorial integrity. It further requires the lifting of all unilateral coercive measures, which are incompatible with international law and have a detrimental impact on Syria's socio-economic condition. We reiterate that the political and humanitarian situations are inextricably linked. Stagnation of the political process has the disastrous effect of prolonging the conflict and in turn worsens the dire humanitarian situation. A holistic approach remains imperative. Syria and its people deserve peace and prosperity. A decade of conflict has already taken too much from them, and the country will only emerge from its despair through positive action. The protection of millions of civilians and the overall stability of the region is dependent on it. We must not continue to fail them. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and I now give the floor to the representative of Kenya.
Thank you, Madam President. I thank Special Envoy Pederson and Mr. Bernard Duhaim for their briefings. As we mark the 10th anniversary of the protracted conflict in Syria, it is disheartening that the people of Syria continue to suffer under an internationalized state of senseless violent wars that have resulted in up to 593,000 deaths, generated a colossal refugee and internal displacement dilemma, ignited a humanitarian crisis of unimaginable proportions and literally impoverish the entire population of a country that once knew peace and dignity. As stated by the Secretary General in his remarks on March 10 in an open court, the people of Syria have endured some of the greatest crimes the world has witnessed this century, close quote, causing him to repeatedly plead with the Security Council to achieve a consensus on this crucial matter. President, the devastating reality of the situation in Syria is an indictment of the multilateralism, particularly the Security Council, as the vanguard of international peace and security. Kenya's delegation, therefore, calls on all members of the Council, especially those that have divergent positions, to close ranks in order to facilitate a long-desired consensus towards a political solution for the sake of the Syrian people. For us to begin to witness the much-needed change in Syria, it is important to revamp the political track underpinned by the following three imperatives. First is the resumption of the Constitutional Committee in a genuine engagement by all the parties with the aim to breed tangible considerations and solutions towards preparing and drafting the Constitution. It is our hope that the recent visit of Special Envoy Pederson to Damascus will generate momentum in this direction. It is critical that the Syrian-led and Syrian-owned political solution adheres to the principles set out in Resolution 2254, including ensuring free and fair elections. Second is the need for constructive international diplomacy to bridge existing divides for the fulfillment of the political track as called for by the Special Envoy. This requires addressing the situation of detainees, including facilitating the release of detained vulnerable groups such as the elderly, as well as women and children, and clarifying the status of missing persons, which would be significant confidence-building measures. Third is the imperative for honoring the nationwide ceasefire by all the parties. In this regard, Kenya commends the Astana guarantors for their continued assurances to uphold the ceasefire. We condemn the attacks in towns near the Syrian-Turkish border and the mutual shelling and targeted airstrikes between armed groups. We are also gravely concerned by the sporadic IED attacks that have resulted in civilian deaths and injuries, and this must come to a stop. Let me conclude by once again echoing the Secretary General by reaffirming that the parties have the opportunity to demonstrate a willingness to find common ground, recognize the needs of all Syrians, and move beyond this protracted state of conflict. Kenya firmly believes that the Security Council and the multilateral order must prioritize the interests and needs of the Syrian people by supporting a Syrian-led and Syrian-owned inclusive dialogue towards a robust political solution. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Kenya for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of China.
Thank you, Madam President. I thank Special Envoy Mr. Pederson and Mr. Duhan for their briefings. The Syrian crisis has lasted for a full decade. Over the past 10 years, Syria has suffered from illegal invasion, external occupation, terrorism, and unilateral sanctions. The national development process has almost stalled, and people's lives are in dire straits. The Security Council should vigorously promote an early end of the Syrian crisis and alleviate the suffering of the Syrian people. Today, I would like to state the following 3 points. First, adhere to the general direction of political settlement. China supports Special Envoy Pederson in continuing to promote the implementation of the Security Council Resolution 2254 and advance the work of the Syrian Constitutional Committee. We call on all parties in Syria to maintain communication with the Special Envoy, carry out in-depth political dialogue on the basis of existing consensus, and make progress at an early date. The Constitutional Committee must remain independent in discharging its functions, adhering to the principle of Syrian-led and Syrian-owned, and be free from outside interference. All parties concerned in the Syrian crisis should actively respond to the Secretary General's global ceasefire initiative, stabilize the security situation in Syria, and create the conditions for political settlement. In addition, the humanitarian and reconstruction assistance to Syria should not be linked to the political process, as doing so violates the principles of humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and independence, and will undermine the mutual trust of all parties. China welcomes the establishment of a tripartite coordination mechanism for Syria by Russia, Qatar, and Turkey, and welcomes the positive considerations by relevant Arab countries for Syrians' return to the Arab League. We hope that this positive momentum will produce pragmatic results and form synergy with the mediation efforts of the UN. The international community should encourage countries in the region to strengthen dialogue and cooperation instead of threatening or obstructing them. Second, the purposes and principles of the UN Charter should be adhered to. Over the years, illegal aggression, occupation, and attacks on Syrian territory have caused turmoil in Syria and the entire region. China has noticed that relevant countries have carried out airstrikes and missile launches against Syria some time ago. The permanent representative of Syria has sent a letter to the President of the Security Council to express concerns. China calls on all parties concerned to respect Syria's sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity and avoid adding new complications to the situation in Syria. The international community should be committed to promoting the unity and tolerance of Syrian society and reject all intentions and actions to separate the country. Third, strengthen anti-terrorism cooperation in Syria. In northwestern Syria, terrorists are entrenched and frequently launch attacks, resulting in civilian casualties. There has been worrying new trends in the activities of the terrorist group Islamic State. Many members of the Council are concerned about the terrorist activities in Syria and their spillover risks. The international community should support the Syrian government's efforts in defending national security and combating terrorist forces in Syria. Madam President, advancing the Syrian political process and restoring peace and tranquility in Syria requires all parties in Syria and the international community to strengthen dialogue, build consensus, and work together. Sanctions and pressure will only cause strong pushback, create more confrontation, intensify and prolong the conflict, bring more suffering to the people of the country concerned, and will not help solving the problems in a fundamental way. I would like to emphasize again that the future of Syria is in the hands of the Syrian people. The Security Council and the international community should adhere to the principle of Syrian-led and Syrian-owned and play a constructive role in achieving an early political settlement of the Syrian issue. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of China for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Ireland.
Thank you, Madam President. As we meet on the 10th anniversary of the outbreak of conflict in Syria, we reflect with deep sadness on the tragic human toll which this conflict has taken on the Syrian people. Today marks 10 years of appalling and needless suffering, 10 years of unbearable conflict leading to countless deaths of innocent civilians. As you yourself said, Madam President, a generation of Syrian children have grown up knowing nothing but conflict, denied their childhood and education, living in fear rather than looking forward in hope. This Council and the international community has a responsibility to act, a responsibility to help ensure that the Syrian people escape the nightmare of this terrible conflict, a responsibility that to date it has yet to meet. This must not continue. Special Envoy Geir Pederson, thank you for your briefing and for your intensive work on the Constitutional Committee and the wider political process. Despite your efforts, the lack of meaningful engagement by the Syrian authorities continues to undermine the work of this committee. The results achieved to date continue to fall far short of the expectations of the people of Syria. Madam President, I take this opportunity to thank the Special Envoy for briefing at last week's ARIA Formula meeting on the occasion of International Women's Day on his efforts to ensure women's full, equal and meaningful participation in the political process. Here we commend your ongoing engagement with the Syrian Women's Advisory Board and with other civil society groups too. As you yourself so aptly observed, the women of Syria are determined to be agents of their own future and not victims of decisions made by others. And this is particularly important when we consider the deeply gendered impacts of the war, including appalling levels of conflict-related sexual violence and sexual and gender-based violence, which have been extensively documented. Sexual violence particularly is prevalent in government detention centres and widely used as a tactic of war, torture and terrorism. Ireland calls again for an immediate end to these human rights violations and abuses and for accountability of the perpetrators. We strongly support the work of the Independent International Commission of Inquiry on Syria, as well as the work of the International, Impartial and Independent Mechanism. The reports of the International Commission of Inquiry on Syria and others, including from civil society, testify to brutal acts, including the bombing of schools, hospitals and other civilian infrastructure. Ireland condemns these acts, as well as attacks on civil society and human rights defenders. Madam President, I want to thank Bernard Duhem of the Working Group on Enforced and Voluntary Disappearances for his informative and impactful briefing on that group's very important work. Those subject to arbitrary detention continue to suffer prolonged incarceration, compounded by the COVID pandemic. Families are left to suffer in limbo without information about their missing loved ones. This is an unconscionable situation. Special Envoy Pederson, we commend your continued efforts on detainees, abductees and missing persons, and we urge you to strengthen your engagement on these issues, including with the Working Group on Enforced and Voluntary Disappearances or other bodies. Ireland supports your calls on the Syrian authorities and on other parties to release those who have been arbitrarily detained and abducted. Madam President, 10 years of war has produced the largest displacement crisis of our time, with almost 6 million Syrians now refugees across the world and the same number internally displaced. Regrettably, conditions enabling their safe and voluntary return, as well as the return of internally displaced persons to their homes, remain a distant prospect. Only sustained progress on respect for human rights and accountability will create the conditions to enable Syrians to return home without fear. In closing, Madam President, let me concur with the Secretary-General that while any political solution must be Syrian-owned and Syrian-led, the international community and this Council must seek to fully support that process. For Ireland, there is still time for the Council to meet its responsibility. This Council should call on the Syrian authorities to engage meaningfully within the Constitutional Committee and a wider political process, as outlined in Resolution 2254. This Council should also continue to demand that the Syrian authorities comply with their obligations under international law and end their brutal policies of suppression, creating instead a Syria where human rights are protected and people no longer live in fear. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Ireland for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Niger.
Madam President, I would like to thank you, and I thank Geir Pederson and Bernard Duhem for their briefings. Madam President, an anniversary should be celebrated, but not for the Syrians, because they have nothing to celebrate today. on the 9th of February this year during the briefing on this same question, it was clear that in Geir Pedersen's statement, we felt a degree of frustration, even a degree of annoyance at the paltry progress made in political dialogue. I'd like to reassure you, Mr. Pedersen, that we do share your frustration. After 10 years of conflict and thousands of deaths, Syria must stop being a laboratory for horrors where everything has been tried and where nothing or very little has been achieved. My delegation is extremely concerned by the ongoing violence. This has seen an increase of ceasefire violations and an uptick in hostilities in the north of Syria, the use of improvised explosive devices and landmines, and the presence of non-exploded ordnances, as well as an increase in the number of airstrikes and bombings, is contributing to increase the number of civilian deaths and injured, including women and children. Madam President, we are convinced that real and tangible progress in the work of the Constitutional Committee, as well as regarding cessations of hostilities, must be fed by progress in other areas. This includes the end of external interference, including support given to arms groups and the pillaging of Syrian resources into Aliyah. The sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of Syria must be respected by all. We would encourage the Special Envoy to continue his good offices to create a political dynamic that integrates the Syrian parties, as well as regional stakeholders, and all stakeholders that can help to push forward this process. Indeed, how can the drafting of a consensus-based constitution be successful in a context where certain groups, deemed terrorist by some and friends by others, are carrying out actions that run counter to the very aim stated? How can we achieve progress in a context of suspicion between the parties and where, whatever we say, sanctions, far from undermining the legitimacy of the Syrian authorities, rather cause interminable suffering to the Syrian people, including women and children? Like all people, Syrians have the right to peace, to security, and they have the right to freely choose their leaders. As elsewhere, negotiations between Syrian parties clearly reflect the balance of power between them, and this balance of power can only be changed through inclusive dialogue led by Syrians and an inclusive process. It is clear today that none of the parties to the conflict in Syria, can have what they want just by military action alone. It's high time for the government and the opposition, with the support of the international community, to definitively resolve to pursue frank and sincere dialogue in order to achieve a lasting resolution to the crisis in the interest, of course, of their country. Madam President, another very important aspect of making progress in the political process is the need to boost confidence building measures, including by releasing civilians, in particular women and children, old people and disabled people. Elderly people rather, and disabled people. These measures can contribute significantly to building confidence and can encourage the necessary compromises to be achieved in the negotiation process. It is the month of March dedicated to women, and so their inclusion and that of young people in the peace process must take into consideration their living conditions and must seek to build their capacity and ability to intervene at all stages of the negotiation process, and should not just be a simple reaffirmation of principles. In conclusion, our duty is to assist Syrian parties to undertake dialogue and not to substitute ourselves for them. To this end, I would urge the members of the Council to make the most of the windows of opportunity that seem to be opening up today and to change their view of Syria regarding the different parts of the crisis. This is a good way that we can support the Special Envoy in his difficult task. Thank you very much indeed, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Niger for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Estonia.
Thank you, Madam President. I thank Special Envoy Pederson for his briefing on the political situation and Mr. Bernard Duhem on the status of detained and missing people in Syria. Today marks 10 years since the start of peaceful protests in Syria. Instead of answering these demands of dignity and justice, the Syrian regime responded with brutal violence. After more than 500,000 deaths, the repressions still continue. Millions have been displaced. Thousands are arbitrarily detained and missing. Complete destruction of the country. Chemical weapons and barrel bombs used against its own people. I recall the words of Secretary General from last week. The situation remains a living nightmare. Madam President, it is the task of the Security Council to uphold and promote international law by acting decisively to the widespread violations of international human rights law in Syria. Many of these acts amount to war crimes and crimes against humanity. Regrettably, so far, it has not been possible. The Secretary General noted that the parties to the Syrian conflict have repeatedly violated international humanitarian law with almost absolute impunity. Estonia reiterates the call of Mr. Duhem and the European Union on the need to create an international mechanism to locate missing people or their remains. There must be accountability for the many war crimes and crimes against humanity and an end to impunity. Investigative mechanisms, such as the IIIM of the General Assembly, Commission of Inquiry of the Human Rights Council, fact-finding missions of OPCW, all these bodies play a central role in collecting evidence and uncovering crimes against Syrian people and moving towards accountability. We fully support these efforts to bring their work closer to the Security Council and in its agenda. The conflict will not end until the Syrian regime stops using torture to suppress free speech and silence its citizens. We demand the release of arbitrarily detained people, especially women, children, and elderly. Looking at the political process, the Syrian Constitutional Committee has not produced expected results. The deadlock continues as the regime refuses to meaningfully engage in the process. Legitimate claims of the Syrian opposition must be taken into account when looking into the future and rebuilding Syria. Estonia and other EU member states support free and fair elections in Syria in accordance with Security Council Resolution 2254 under supervision of the United Nations, with all Syrians, including members of the diaspora, eligible to participate. Anything else would be considered yet another farce. We remind the Syrian authorities and its allies that European Union will not fund Syria's reconstruction and lift sanctions until a genuine political process is firmly in place. Estonia and the European Union remain committed to finding a lasting and credible political solution to the conflict in Syria. We encourage all international actors to support Syrians in achieving these aims, which are also implicit in the roadmap for peace set out in the Security Council Resolution 2254 and the 2012 Geneva Communiqué. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Estonia for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Vietnam.
I thank you, Madam President. I thank Special Envoy Geir Pederson and Ms. Bernard Duhaim for their briefing. I would like to welcome the representative of Syria, Turkey, and Iran to this meeting. Madam President, over the past 10 years, the international community, including the Security Council, international and regional actors, have exerted every effort to put an end to the crisis in Syria. There have been certain steps forward that allows us to believe in a tangible outcome. For instance, the Geneva, Astana processes and other diplomatic efforts have been able to bring parties to the negotiation table. The relative calm situation on the ground is preserved in the past years following the ceasefire agreement in Idlib. Humanitarian assistance continues to reach people in need despite certain operational challenges. However, lasting peace and stability do not appear in sight. One may grow accustomed to hearing about the plight of millions of Syrian peoples, which continuously worsened with further impact of the growing economic meltdown and the COVID-19 pandemic. Hundreds of thousands have died, millions have had to seek refuge or been displaced. 65% of the population is dependent on humanitarian assistance, while 60% face food insecurity. Terrorism is still threatening people's lives. And one of the main reasons for this is the lack of confidence and trust among parties. Madam President, Resolution 2254, unanimously adopted by the Security Council in 2015, stresses that the only solution to the crisis in Syria is through an inclusive Syrian-led political process. Vietnam reaffirms our strong support for a comprehensive political solution which is led and owned by the Syrian and facilitated by the UN, in accordance with international law and the UN Charter, including the full respect of the sovereignty, unity, territorial integrity, and non-interference in the internal affairs of Syria. To further promote a political settlement, my delegation would like to set the following. First, confidence building and dialogue. Divergence after years of conflict cannot be bridged overnight. Confidence building measures, therefore, can help ensure progressive achievement. Vietnam supports the critical role played by the UN, the Special Envoy, and all international actors in encouraging the political solution in Syria. We call on the Syrian party to engage in constructive dialogue in order to achieve breakthroughs within the Constitutional Committee framework, as well as in a broader political process. We're seeking a workable solution to the current crisis. It is indispensable that trust and confidence are also built among international interlocutors. There should be renewed international effort in order to make a meaningful contribution to the peaceful settlement of the conflict. Second, preserving stability. The relative calm situation remains fragile as a sporadic insecurity incidents have still happening in the northwest as well as in the northeast and the south. It is concerning that hostility continues to claim lives and impact the livelihood of civilians. We urge all parties to exercise maximum restraint, refrain from action that could lead to further escalation. Stability is vital to enable dialogue effort. Third, continued assistance of international community. Efforts to achieving sustainable peace and development for the Syrian people must always be coupled with our unwavering support. We call for continued assistance for the Syrian people in all areas and by all means in order to facilitate a peaceful solution of crisis and to help settle their extremely dire living conditions. It is also necessary to find a long-term solution to the hardship and strengthen the resilience of the population. Madam President, the past 10 years have brought about dissolution and misery. A healthy environment is needed to facilitate a viable political solution. We believe that it can only be achieved if there is a unity of the international community in supporting Syria. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Vietnam for his statement, and I now call on the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, Madam President. And I'd like to start by thanking Special Envoy Pederson and Monsieur Bernard for their briefings. 10 years ago, Syrians took to the streets peacefully to call for an end to regime oppression, torture, and corruption. Assad and his regime answered those calls with brutal violence, chemical weapons, and starvation. The latest Commission of Inquiry reports highlights the horrific scale of atrocities and the tragic suffering of Syrian people in the past decade. Over 500,000 Syrians have lost their lives. Tens of thousands more have been forcibly detained, tortured, or disappeared. Over 12 million refugees cannot return home without fear of further violence or arbitrary arrest and torture. As we've heard from the Special Envoy and the Secretary General, this is a living nightmare. This grim 10-year milestone is a reminder that we, the United Kingdom and the wider international community, should do all in our power to strengthen accountability for the perpetrators of the most serious crimes in Syria. We continue to support the Syrian people and international efforts to assist victims of human rights abuses and violations, and are pleased to be finalising an agreement with the IIIM to support this. The UK's autonomous Syria Sanctions regime has designated over 350 individuals and entities responsible for repressing civilians in Syria or enabling the Assad regime to keep doing so. Today, the UK has announced further sanctions against 6 individuals that fall into this category. These sanctions send a clear message to the Assad regime and its backers. We will not stand by while you continue to commit heinous crimes against the Syrian people. Meaningful progress on detainees and missing persons is a central element of Security Council Resolution 2254 that could build confidence towards a political process. As a starting point, the Syrian authorities should provide comprehensive lists of the names of all detainees, clarifying the whereabouts of people who have never emerged from arbitrary detention. The UK continues to support the International Commission on Missing Persons work with Syrian families of the missing to secure their rights to justice, truth, and reparations, as well as ICMP's critical work to build an impartial database of all those who have gone missing, regardless of their origin, role in the conflict, or the circumstances of their disappearance. The UK reiterates its unwavering support to Mr. Pederson and calls once again on the regime and its backers to engage seriously with the political process outlined in Resolution 2254. Though the situation is desperate, the people of Syria have shown incredible resilience, and hope for the future lies with them. The UK stands with the Syrian people to deliver all the steps enshrined in Resolution 2254, a nationwide ceasefire, unhindered aid access, the release of those arbitrarily detained, conditions for safe refugee return, and free and fair elections pursuant to a new constitution, all of which represent the only way out of this conflict. Like you, Madam President, we hope that the 11th anniversary of this conflict will not pass in the same way as the 10th. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of the UK for her statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Tunisia.
شكرا السيدة الرئيسة. أشكر.
Thank you, Madam President.
I'd like to thank Special Envoy for Syria, Geir Pederson, as well as Mr. Duhaim for their briefings. I also welcome the participation of representatives of Syria, Turkey, and Iran in this meeting. We are meeting today as the Syrian crisis has been ongoing for 10 years, and the situation is particularly delicate in the country. The population is suffering from indescribable suffering as the conflict continues, and a political solution does not seem to be appearing on the horizon. The factors of this crisis are numerous and interlinked. The situation is ever more complex, and its impact is affecting the entire region. On this occasion, we would like to reiterate Tunisia's position of principle. We do not see a military solution to this conflict. We need to accelerate efforts towards a sustainable political solution in line with terms of the Resolution 2254, and this in a way that meets the aspirations and the will of the Syrian people, so that stability and security can be reestablished in Syria while preserving its sovereignty, independence, unity, and territorial integrity. The situation in Syria has constantly changed over the past 10 years, and it is clear that putting an end to the crisis will be impossible as long as divisions and polarization persist. It is the spirit of dialogue and cooperation that needs to prevail so that trust can be built in order to address the roots of the crisis and contribute to achieving political and social stability in Syria, allowing Syria to find its natural place in the Arab region. That is why the Syrian parties must redouble their efforts to return to the negotiating tables in order to find a political settlement. In this context, we look forward to seeing a resumption of the Constitutional Committee talks in Geneva as soon as possible. And we hope that these talks will continue to take place more regularly in order to achieve progress in reform. We urge the parties to put the interests of the Syrian people first through constructive engagement that will allow for a compromise and ground for understanding to be achieved. We reiterate our support to the constitutional process and the broader political process, as well as support for the efforts of the Special Envoy, Mr. Pederson, including when it comes to structuring and organizing the work of the Constitutional Committee. It goes without saying that in order to make progress in these processes, broader support from the Security Council is required. The Council must speak in a common voice and make a sincere efforts to agree on various topics surrounding this crisis. Madam President, an environment that is favorable to overcoming the crisis must be created through a comprehensive ceasefire across Syria, as well as through respect for international humanitarian and human rights law and the protection of civilians by the parties to the conflict. We also call for a safe, voluntary, and dignified return of all Syrian refugees. The participation of Syrian women must be guaranteed in the political process along the various representatives of civil society. Stability means the end of terrorism, and we need a collective approach based on international law as we combat terrorist groups designated by the Security Council, whether it be on Syrian territory or outside it. This is necessary to ensure bringing about peace and security in the region. Madam President, there is a great need for comprehensive practical methods of action that will account for all the factors fueling the crisis while respecting provisions of Resolution 2254 of the Security Council in order to reverse the negative security, humanitarian, and socioeconomic trends in Syria.
In conclusion, we have great hopes in the ability of Syrian society to emerge from this crisis with the assistance of the international community. This crisis has lasted for too long, and the Syrian people will be able to build a future in peace, security, and social harmony. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Tunisia for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of India.
Thank you, Madam President. Let me begin by thanking Special Envoy Mr. Geir Pederson for his briefing on the recent developments in Syria. He has traveled to Damascus as well as to Moscow and Sochi and held meetings with important stakeholders. I thank him for his candid views reflecting the current state of play and his assessment of the situation. I also thank Mr. Bernard Doheim, member of OHCHR's UN Working Group on Enforced and Involuntary Disappearances, for his briefing. It is indeed disheartening that as we approach the 10th year of conflict in Syria, peace and stability unfortunately remain elusive to the country and its people. The political transition in Syria, facilitated by the UN, is not an exclusive process. 5 rounds of meetings of the drafting body of the Syrian Constitutional Committee have resulted in very little progress. External influence is also adversely impacting the process. The situation on the ground does not present an optimistic picture. It will be unrealistic to expect any dramatic outcomes in the near future unless the international community takes decisive collective steps in the right direction and bridge differences. If we are serious about achieving progress, we need to have greater convergence of views and act to strengthen the hands of the Special Envoy. Constructive international diplomacy is the need of the hour to bridge existing divides by focusing on mutual and reciprocal steps. We believe that delinking the humanitarian and development work with progress on the political track will help in creating a conducive environment of trust and confidence. We welcome the 15th round of the international meeting of the Astana process held last month in Sochi. We call on all parties to the conflict to show political will and statesmanship to break the current impasse in the working of the Constitutional Committee. The Syrian conflict and involvement of external actors has contributed to the growth of terrorism in Syria and in its neighboring countries. This has been reiterated in the latest report of the Secretary General on the threat posed by ISIL. We express our serious concern with the increased presence and terrorist activity of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham and other affiliated terrorist groups that pose a threat to civilians inside and outside the Idlib de-escalation area. It is imperative that all parties adhere to international obligations to fight terrorism and terrorist organizations in Syria as designated by the Security Council. India firmly believes that long-term security and stability in the region can only be achieved by preserving the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Syria. We also remain convinced that there can be no military solution to the Syrian conflict and reaffirm our commitment to advancing a Syrian-led and a Syrian-owned UN-facilitated political process in line with the UN Security Council Resolution 2254. Madam President, the 10-year-long Syrian conflict has brought untold suffering to the Syrian people. The COVID-19 pandemic has further compounded the situation, posing serious challenges to fragile health infrastructure. There is an urgent need to increase humanitarian assistance to all Syrians throughout the country without discrimination, politicization, and any preconditions. The humanitarian crisis, exacerbated by the pandemic, calls for relaxation of sanctions imposed on Syria. The international community must act with a sense of urgency to help the Syrian people. We remain convinced that all efforts towards improving the humanitarian situation in Syria will positively impact the political track as well. We call upon the wider UN system, in particular the WHO and OCHA, to prioritize the vaccination program in Syria, including through the COVAX initiative. As we have mentioned in our earlier statements on Syria, India has extended developmental assistance and human resource development support to Syria regularly. These include lines of credit for developmental projects, supply of medicine and food, artificial limb fitment camp, and capacity building training programs for Syrian nationals. We reiterate our commitment to continue these initiatives in support of the people of Syria. Finally, on this 10th anniversary of conflict, let us reaffirm our resolve to help the people of Syria. India stands ready to continue to render all possible help and support to the Syrian people. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of India for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of France.
Madame la Présidente, je souhaiterais d'abord remercier l'envoyé spécial et Monsieur.
Madam President, I would like to thank the Special Envoy and Mr. Burhan Dunem for their briefings. Today, we commemorate a sad anniversary, indeed that of 10 years of war in Syria, and I would like to pay tribute to the hundreds of thousands of civilian victims. 10 years ago, the Assad regime chose to respond with indiscriminate repression to the demands of freedom and dignity expressed peacefully by its population. He tortured, besieged, and bombarded his own population, including with chemical weapons, in order to ensure that its clan remained in power rather than concede the slightest opening. Today, Syria is devastated. We all have in mind the figures that challenge our conscience. Half of the population is displaced or has taken refuge in neighboring countries. 13 million people need humanitarian assistance. Tens of thousands have disappeared. Youth are paying a heavy price for the ongoing conflict, and some have known nothing but war, as was said. Even today, war continues in Syria. Hostilities are increasing in the north. Instability is chronic in areas forcibly recaptured by the regime, and Daesh is reconstituting its forces. This demonstrates the failure of the scorched earth policy being pursued by the regime and its allies. Only a political solution will allow Syria as a whole to recover and avoid another lost decade. France echoes the appeal of the Secretary General for parties to take the opportunity for dialogue on this anniversary. It is an illusion to think that one actor can impose himself by force of arms and expect international redemption. It is therefore high time for the regime to engage in good faith in negotiations in Geneva, for which the Syrian Negotiating Committee has proposed a reasonable timeline. The regime now bears full responsibility for blocking the Constitutional Committee, which has made no progress almost for a year and a half after its establishment. The success of the committee cannot be a precondition to any further context. It is progress. It is urgent to establish a broader political process in line with Resolution 2254. This means working towards establishing a national ceasefire and preparing for the holding of elections, free and transparent elections under the supervision of United Nations, in which the diaspora will be able to participate. France also supports any initiatives that will allow to make progress on the issue of detainees. And we note the appeals to establish an international mechanism on this issue, and in parallel encourages the Special Envoy to work on this area. We encourage the Special Envoy to address all of these aspects, in fact, and to report back to the Council. Without a credible political settlement, France and its partner will remain steadfast in their position on reconstruction, normalization, and sanctions. These positions were taken in response to the brutal repressions of the regime against its populations and grave violations of human rights committed by its officials. Yet these violations persist. It is unrealistic to think that sham elections planned for the summer will be enough to change these positions. We will not recognize the outcome of elections that do not meet the criteria laid out in Resolution 2254. We will continue to lend our full support to international mechanisms for fighting impunity. In that context, progress in national judicial procedures will be important steps in ensuring that those responsible for these crimes do not remain unpunished. Madam President, the conflict in Syria has lasted too long, but France remained more determined than ever to do everything to bring Syria back to peace. I thank you.
I thank the representative of France for her statement. And I would like to again draw attention of speakers to paragraph 22 of Note 507, which encourages all participants in council meetings to deliver their statements in 5 minutes or less, in line with the Security Council's commitment to making more effective use of open meetings. I now give the floor to the representative of the Syrian Arab Republic.
Madam President, it is clear to those following the session today that this is yet another attempt by some countries to seize the 10-year anniversary of the crisis in Syria as an opportunity to continue to rally against the Syrian state, leveling all kinds of accusations against it and promoting their failed policies. Therefore, I would like to give an honest account of what happened in Syria over the past 10 years, to clarify all the facts. On this day, 10 years ago, the governments of some countries, mainly the United States, the United Kingdom, and France, launched an unprecedented war of aggression on Syria, a multifaceted war, to undermine Syria's national positions, to target the legitimate government, and to tarnish the image of its leadership. They did so through their terrorist proxies, in a grave violation of the principles of international law and the provisions of the UN Charter. This goes to show that those countries gave precedence to the law of force over the force of law. Over the past 10 years, those governments have made every effort to pit Syrians against each other and to sow chaos that they considered creative. They spent huge sums of money to fuel and prolong a tragic crisis, aiming to undermine Syria's security and stability, its historic achievements, its development, and its territorial integrity. The past 10 years have proven that those governments do not learn from their previous experiences. They keep going back to the same old rulebook and applying the same old strategies, using extremist terrorist groups as a tool to serve their hostile agendas. Those governments have recruited terrorists from all over the world and transferred them to Syria, facilitated by the Turkish regime, to cause death and wreak havoc in my country. The great irony is that these same governments used those terrorists as an excuse to form an illegal international coalition to combat terrorism based on a distorted interpretation of Article 51 of the Charter. This illegal coalition has killed thousands of innocent civilians. What happened in Raqqa is a case in point. The true goal of this illegal coalition was not to combat terrorist groups of its own making. Its true goal was to weaken the Syrian Arab Army as it fights ISIS and other terrorist groups. The true goal of this illegal coalition is to weaken the Syrian government by destroying civilian facilities such as schools, hospitals, power plants, bridges, and dams, causing tremendous human suffering. This so-called international coalition is in fact an American coalition that US administrations use to attack the people of the region. Over the past 10 years, those countries have given terrorist groups free rein to kill and displace people, to change the demography of the region, to recruit children, plunder the oil and cultural property, burn agricultural crops, and deprive the population of drinking water. Add to that what can be considered a Turkification policy practiced by the Turkish regime in the areas it occupies. Over the past 10 years, the delegates of those countries repeated the same hypocritical statements, expressing their grave concern over the humanitarian situation in Syria, while at the same time applying unilateral coercive measures, imposing a suffocating siege on the Syrian people, and preventing reconstruction. All of that resulted in catastrophic consequences for every Syrian citizen that affected every aspect of their lives, especially women and children. These unilateral coercive measures are so cruel, they can only be considered economic terrorism. Over the past 10 years, those governments have paid lip service to Syria's sovereignty, unity, and territorial integrity, preaching that the solution can only be political, not military. All the while, they have violated in the worst way possible the sovereignty and independence of Syria. American military forces have been operating in the northeast and the southeast of Syria, while Turkish forces have been active in the north and the northwest, not to mention the continued Israeli occupation of the Syrian Arab Golan and the systematic attacks it carries out every day. After all of this, how could we believe that those countries support a political solution in Syria? How could we believe they adhere to Resolution 2254 when they deliberately and systematically violate its main provision, namely respect for the sovereignty, independence, unity, and territorial integrity of the Syrian Arab Republic? The destructive policies of the past 10 years were doomed to fail, thanks to the resilience of the Syrian people, united behind their leadership. After such failure, shouldn't those governments now rethink their policies? Or do they want another decade of failed policies and more destruction in Syria? Those governments must now look realistically at the current situation in Syria and realize the impact of their hostile policies on Syria in particular and the region in general. They must act to correct those wrong policies and adopt new constructive approaches based on respect for international law, based on diplomacy and objective dialogue, in order to allow the return of peace and stability to Syria and the region. Madam President, we have listened carefully to the briefing of the Special Envoy, which we had hoped would address adequately and clearly the various aspects that I referred to above, especially the actual obstacles to achieving a political solution. We call on the United Nations and its Special Envoy to take a clear position on these challenges and these violations, and to exercise their role in implementing and protecting the purposes and principles of the Charter, which Syria helped draft. In mid-February, the 15th round of the Astana format was held in the Russian city of Sochi and issued a significant declaration that reaffirmed the strong commitment to the sovereignty, unity, and territorial integrity of the Syrian Arab Republic, and continued cooperation until the complete elimination of terrorist groups in Syria. The declaration also rejected separatist agendas that aim to undermine the sovereignty, unity, and territorial integrity of Syria, as well as attempts to create a de facto situation on the ground under the pretext of combating terrorism. The Astana Declaration also rejected the plunder of Syrian oil, that is the exclusive property of the Syrian state, and the unilateral coercive measures imposed on Syria. It condemned the continued Israeli attacks on Syria and demanded an end to such aggression. Finally, the declaration expressed support to the political Syrian-owned, Syrian-led process, including the Constitutional Committee. In this context, my delegation would like to thank the delegations of the Russian Federation and the Islamic Republic of Iran for their continued contribution to the success of this round. We call on the Turkish regime to fulfill its obligations under the Astana agreements and the Sochi understandings, and to cease its practices that do not contribute to an environment conducive to a political solution. Madam President, Damascus welcomed the visit of Special Envoy Mr. Geir Pederson on February 22nd. Mr. Pederson held constructive talks with the Foreign Minister, who reaffirmed Syria's commitment to a Syrian-owned and Syrian-led political process, facilitated by the United Nations in accordance with the relevant Security Council resolutions. These resolutions all affirm, in their preamble, the strong commitment to the sovereignty, independence, unity, and territorial integrity of the Syrian Arab Republic. In this regard, my delegation stresses that for the work of the Constitutional Committee to succeed, its agreed rules of procedures must be respected. We reject any external interference in its work and any attempt to dictate its conclusions or impose artificial deadlines. We look forward to the holding of the 6th round of the Constitutional Committee as soon as possible. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of the Syrian Arab Republic for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the Islamic Republic of Iran.
Thank you, Madam President. In the past 10 years, the Syrian people have suffered greatly from the Syrian conflict that also has had adverse consequences on the peace, security, and stability of the entire region. These cannot and must not continue indefinitely. At the 10th anniversary of the start of the Syrian conflict, all efforts must be made to end the fighting. In this context, a number of key principles are of paramount importance and must be observed fully, effectively, and in good faith by all. This crisis has no military solution and must therefore be settled peacefully and in full conformity with international law, particularly the principles enshrined in the UN Charter. The conflict cannot and will not end without ensuring the full sovereignty, unity, and territorial integrity of the Syrian Arab Republic. This can in no way be compromised. Neither the Syrian people will accept the continued occupation of their territory or violation of their sovereignty, nor must the international community accept this, as it runs counter to the cardinal principles of international law. We once again call for the immediate withdrawal of all foreign forces present in Syria without the permission of its government, particularly US forces that continue to occupy parts of the Syrian territory. In this context, we condemn the unlawful military strike on the Syrian-Iraqi border on 25th February 2021. Such unlawful acts escalate the already tense situation in the region and hence must stop. Equally, we condemn the continued Israeli military attacks in Syria. They are unlawful, provocative, and destabilizing. The Israeli regime must be compelled to put an end to such military adventurism. Similarly, restoring Syria's territorial integrity requires unabated fighting with all terrorist groups, as any pause in such operations will allow them to consolidate their presence and atrocious activities in Syria, prolong the conflict, and delay the political solution of the crisis. Of course, protection of civilians must at all times be a guiding principle in combating terrorists. We also strongly reject abusing counterterrorism efforts to support any separatist tendencies or illegitimate self-rule initiatives or violation of Syrian sovereignty. A truly Syrian-led, Syrian-owned, UN-facilitated political process is critical. Along with the Astana guarantors, Iran supports the work of the Constitutional Committee and stresses that its work should continue without foreign interference and externally imposed timelines. Likewise, while the committee's work must be governed by a sense of compromise and constructive engagement, the construction of the country and the return of refugees and displaced persons must go hand in hand with the political process. They are interlinked, mutually inclusive, and mutually reinforcing. Mounting political and economic pressures against the Syrian government and people, or making multiple preconditions for the peaceful settlement of the crisis has proven to be counterproductive. Measures such as politicizing humanitarian aid, return of refugees and displaced persons, and in particular imposing unilateral sanctions, only prolong both the crisis and sufferings of the Syrian people, who are already suffering seriously from other hardships, particularly the COVID-19 pandemic. By any measure, these sanctions are unlawful and inhumane, violate the basic human rights of the Syrian people, and must therefore be removed immediately. Iran is committed to political resolution of this crisis and will continue supporting the people and government of Syria to restore the unity and territorial integrity of their country. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of the Islamic Republic of Iran for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Turkey.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, I would like to thank Special Envoy Pederson and Mr. Duhaim for their briefings. Today marks 10 years since the beginning of the Syrian war. We should all take a moment to recount the tremendous human toll and immense suffering this decade-long conflict brought upon Syrian people. There is not a single Syrian family untouched by this human-made disaster. Millions of innocent civilians paid a heavy price in their quest for democracy, freedom, and dignity. Over the years, the regime's atrocities and crimes have come in many forms. Aerial bombings with chemical weapons, cluster and incendiary bombs, deliberate attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructures, torture, arbitrary detention, abduction, forced disappearances, sexual abuse, sieges, denial of humanitarian and medical aid, and more. 500,000 died in the hands of the Assad regime and its backers. Half of the population has been either internally displaced or forced to flee their beloved country. Turkey alone hosts nearly 4 million Syrians. This is almost 1/5 of the entire population of Syria before the start of the conflict. 13.4 million Syrians in the country are in need of humanitarian aid. 5.9 million people are homeless. By far, the Syrian conflict is the gravest humanitarian tragedy of the century. Yet, despite growing humanitarian needs, scope of the cross-border mechanism has been downsized over the course of the years from 4 border crossings to mere 1. As the Secretary General emphasized, more humanitarian access is needed. Intensified cross-line and cross-border deliveries are essential to reach everyone in need everywhere. Madam President, the conflict had a staggering impact on children. While their peers elsewhere learned how to read and write, Syrian children had to learn how to take cover and survive. The war has left the lives and the future of a generation of Syrian children hanging by a thread. Almost 12,000 children were killed or injured throughout the conflict. Only last week, 2 children were killed when ammunition left over from previous shelling exploded while they were playing in suburbs of Raqqa. Nearly 90% of children are in need of humanitarian assistance. This signifies a 20% increase in the past year alone. More than 500,000 children under the age of 5 in Syria suffer from stunting due to chronic malnutrition. Almost 2.5 million children in Syria are out of school. Number of children displaying symptoms of psychosocial distress doubled in 2020 as continued exposure to violence and trauma has had a significant impact on children's mental health. Madam President, the use of chemical weapons by the Syrian regime has been part of its brutal war against its own people with devastating humanitarian consequences. Emboldened by a growing sense of impunity, the regime has repeatedly resorted to chemical weapons on at least 7 occasions as established by the OPCW. The Syrian conflict also had a profound impact on the fragile regional security and stability. Neighboring countries had to cope with both the humanitarian fallout and the terrorist threat emanating from Syria. Over the course of the conflict, terror groups established their own so-called states in Syrian territory because this tyrant in Damascus has denied Syrian people their basic rights. By releasing terrorists from prisons, ceding territory to and purchasing oil from them, the Assad regime has bred, raised, and nurtured the extremist and separatist terrorists that flourished in our doorstep. Today, PKK-YPG poses a real and present threat to Syrian civilians and the country's unity. PKK-YPG, following in the footsteps of regime, is releasing Daesh fighters and their families, effectively paving the way for a resurgence of Daesh. When will some member states learn that there is no such thing as a good terrorist? If we are genuine about the stability of Syria and the wider region, it is time to put an end to this. There can be no lasting peace in Syria for as long as the country remains a safe haven for terrorists. Madam President, as the Secretary General pointed out, it is impossible to fully fathom the extent of the devastation in Syria, but its people have endured some of the greatest crimes the world has witnessed during this century. Without an end to the atrocities, there cannot be an end to the war. The international community may be tired of the Syrian conflict, but the Syrian people are determined. Their demands and expectations are still valid. They will persevere in their struggle for dignity and freedom. That is why there should be no illusion. The regime can never achieve military victory. A military solution cannot bring any legitimacy or create a lasting settlement. Legitimacy can only be achieved through a negotiated political settlement that meets the aspirations of Syrian people. Constitutional Committee's work is critical to achieve this ultimate goal in line with the Security Council Resolution 2254. At previous Council meetings, I emphasized the necessity to fend off regime stonewalling tactics. We regret that progress could not be achieved in the 5th round of talks due to regime's obstruction. We broadly agree with Special Envoy Pederson's assessment. In Geneva, we followed the meetings closely, encouraging the opposition to be constructive and flexible. It is obvious that the opposition has performed remarkably during the last round and over the last 15 months since the establishment of the committee. The international community should recognize the strong commitment of the opposition. The committee meetings must be conducted seriously and deliver concrete outcomes swiftly. We understand that Special Envoy Pederson had useful meetings in Damascus, Moscow, Istanbul, and that the Syrian parties exchanged ideas for the conduct of the next round. If the 6th round could be convened, it is imperative to start going into the substance of the constitution. This is essential for the continuation of this process. Now is the chance for the regime to prove that it truly wants a political solution. Let me remind you that the Constitutional Committee is the sole functioning mechanism for the implementation of Resolution 2254. Therefore, this Council has a special responsibility to support this work and not allow the regime to backtrack again. Madam President, the mere presence of the regime representative here is an affront to millions of Syrians who suffered countless crimes at the hands of the regime for a decade. His hallucinatory statement and delusional accusations do not merit a response. Lest he claims again to be my legitimate counterpart, I will tell him this. His regime has blood of innocent people on its hands and lost its legitimacy a decade ago. The answer to the criminal regime he represents will be given by the Syrian people when they will save and rebuild Syria. Madam President, we remember the first day the Syrians took to the streets and asked for their freedom. We can easily tell the history of the conflict, and we know how this conflict can come to a peaceful end. But we can never have the unique perspective of a Syrian who has been suffering in the hands of the regime. It is the innocent Syrian people who have to live with constant fear, who have to bury their loved ones, and who have to live without any hope in sight. It is the innocent Syrian people who must run for their lives, survive bombings and starvation. After 10 years, you must feel a sense of urgency about it. In Dr. King's words, the fierce urgency of now, because people are being killed as we speak. The hopes for a better life are dying as we speak. After 10 years, what's happening in Syria is a crime against humanity. What's happening in Syria is a crime against everything this United Nations Charter stands for. It's a crime against the very purpose of this council, and we can still do something to stop it. The constant excuses for inaction no longer suffice. It is time to stop talking about how sorry we are. It is time to remember the last killed Syrian, and it is time to do something to prevent the next killing. This human-made catastrophe will not end before the people of Syria have a legitimate government in accordance with Resolution 2254 that truly represents their will and that enjoys their full consent. It is not going to end until the Syrians live in a democratic, secure, prosperous, and secular Syria. Until then, Turkey will continue to stand by the innocent people of Syria and their legitimate aspirations. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Turkey for his statement. There are no more speakers inscribed on the list. The meeting is adjourned.